Henleaze is a quiet, upmarket residential suburb of Bristol, and normally nothing happens. On the 8th December 1946, a nation weary of post-war rationing was about to undergo some of the worst winter weather since records began. When the trial opened in 1947, the whole nation was involved in curtain twitching, where respectable members of society were accused of murder and a so-called normal marriage had scenes of sexual perversion. Prepare yourself for smelling salts as James describes this tale.
The year is 1942, in the residential suburb of Henleaze in Bristol. On the cold winter's evening of the 8th of December, a call was made to the ambulance service from a public phone box asking for help at an address in Wellington Hill West. The female caller made the request calmly, announcing to the telephone operator that she thought her husband was dead. When the ambulance arrived, a woman was seen quietly waiting by the front door. She explained that her husband had been taking a bath, and after what she thought was an unusually long time, went upstairs to investigate. On opening the bathroom door, she found her husband with his head under water and unresponsive. The ambulance men rushed upstairs and found the man, not in the bathroom, which had been assumed, but hiding in the bedroom, wrapped in a sheet on the floor. Things were not looking good, and urgent efforts were made to revive him, to no avail. It all seemed a little strange, so a doctor and the police were summoned. The man, it turned out, was 34-year-old Cecil Cornock. The Cornock's doctor, by the name of Gordon Fells, arrived in the early hours of the morning and pronounced death, which he estimated to have been around 4 hours earlier. He also noted that there were several recent injuries to the body. The pathologist arrived at the scene at dawn, and after his examination pronounced that there were multiple injuries all over the corpse, but more ominously, there were bruises on the wrists, signs that they had been tightly bound. The police, when they looked in the bathroom, found that the bath itself was dry and devoid of any traces of water. The bathroom window had been closed and the curtains drawn. However, the water heater had been damaged and had fallen from the wall onto the bathroom floor. The medical findings were confirmed at the post-mortem, where it was concluded Cornock's death had been caused by drowning. It was further noted that the body had received severe blows to the back of the head, which would have rendered the victim unconscious. The pathologist suggested that the wrists had been tied behind the victim's back, and that his legs had either been tied or tightly held while he was submerged in the bathwater. Anne Cornock, Cecil's wife, had been spoken to by the police in the living room after they had been called. They took an initial statement where she told them that Cecil had been suffering from flu and decided to take a bath to make himself feel better. She had run the bath for him, but had rushed downstairs when she heard a knock on the front door. The visitor was a friend by the name of Ken Bedford. Cecil said hello to his friend before going upstairs to have his bath. According to Anne's account, she chatted to Ken for some time before becoming concerned about the length of time that her husband had spent upstairs. She had gone to the bathroom, where she discovered him motionless. Her first thought was to try and revive her husband, and she pulled the plug out of the bath to drain the water and turned off the hot water heater on the wall before calling downstairs to Ken for help. The both of them then tried to retrieve the dead husband from the now empty bath. Due to his weight and the fact that he was wet, by Anne's account, it became quite a struggle. He was dropped and bumped several times while they dragged him to the bedroom, thus explaining away the perceived injuries to the body. In the course of this struggle, the wall-mounted hot water heater had been bumped several times, which caused it to fall to the floor. Once in the bedroom, they had tried artificial respiration in order to attempt to revive Cecil, but this had proved to be futile. After a while, they were both exhausted, and went downstairs and made a cup of tea. Knowing that she would have to go outside to the phone box on a cold winter's evening, she changed into some dry clothes, as the ones she had been wearing were soaking wet. Perhaps strangely, while waiting for the ambulance to arrive, she had gone upstairs to the bathroom and cleaned the bath. Ken Bedford also went through the process of a preliminary interview by the police at the house. He suffered from arthritis and he was not very sprightly and had to walk using a stick, and it would have taken him some time to get up the stairs, and he would have struggled with a slippery body on a wet bathroom floor. All in all, to get the body out of the bath, during which time, due to the struggles involved, the injuries to the body could have occurred. He later made a second statement at the police station, which in part contradicted what he had originally said about when and where attempts at resuscitation had originally occurred. His story also differed when the tea break actually happened. These discrepancies certainly caused concern in the eyes of the police. Small details, but important ones, that started to arouse suspicion, especially as these were the only two witnesses. Anne was also recalled to make another statement. In it, she admitted that she had lied at Ken's request, since he had not arrived at the house in the evening, but had in fact been there all day. The reason behind this, curiously, was that a few weeks earlier he had been party to another suspicious sudden death. The story went that in August he had been out for the evening with Anne's niece Pauline Keeling. On the way home, Pauline had suddenly collapsed in the street. Unfortunately, she had died a few days later in hospital from heart failure, the cause of which was never identified. Ken had felt that it could look a bit odd if he was connected to the second death, so soon after the first one, so Anne agreed to his request. The following day, the police brought Ken back in for yet another chat. He claimed that he had lied about his time at the house, as he did not wish people to think he was a regular visitor. But what he said next was truly shocking. He informed the police that Ken's hands had been tied behind his back when he was retrieved from the bath, and that he was worried that it would be thought that he had something to do with it. He appeared not to be fazed by the fact that the dead husband had been tied up in the first place. Was there a strange dynamic between him and Anne? Apparently, they had first met at Pauline's funeral, which was held at her parents' house in Northampton Street in Bath. They struck up a friendship, and he would sometimes make a visit to Henleaze, and had in the past stayed the weekend. Cecil Cornock worked for the Wartime Ministry of Airplane Production as a cost supervisor, and his work often took him away from home. He was aware of Ken's visits, which naturally caused him concern, and had decided to speak to him about it. Cecil was also planning a permanent move to London and take his family with him. It could be assumed that there was something going on between Anne and Ken. Letters between the two were discovered at the Henleaze property, and they were certainly written in warm terms between the two, such that they wished to be together on a more permanent basis. Anne was certainly not happy in her current marital situation. She also revealed that she was forced to endure what she described as strange sexual practices on regular occasions with her husband. Today they may seem more commonplace, but in the 1940s they were seen as taboo or perversions. Anne had told Ken in graphic detail some of these practices, so perhaps it's not surprising that to Ken, seeing Cecil tied up in the bath may not have been out of place. No wonder that Ken would have wanted to preserve Anne's very strange private life by not divulging the true picture to the police. The police detectives were not so sympathetic. Anne had already told them that she thought that her husband was a pervert who could become violent if his wife did not acquiesce to his demands. The police, on searching the house, had found what they described as paraphernalia consisting of a cane, rope and other items, which could account for some of the wounds on the deceased's body. Anne finally admitted that before Cecil's last bath, she had tied his wrists, but had insisted that the rope was removed before he got in the bath. The police pointed out that the rope that they had found had been wet, indicating that the victim had been tied up when he was in the bath. Anne responded that Cecil had accidentally dropped it in the water and insisted that he was not tied up. She also further denied that she was in any type of relationship with Ken. Ken, however, had admitted that he exchanged kisses with Anne, but he said that it was no more than that. These explanations did not ring true in the minds of the police, and on the 10th of December she was formally arrested and charged with the murder of her husband. In January, the case was heard before magistrates, and the outcome was that Anne was committed for trial at the Bristol Crown Court for the murder of Cecil Cornock. She was remanded in prison to await trial in Cardiff, where a routine medical check in February revealed that she was 2 months pregnant. Ken Bedford was not charged, since it was believed that due to his arthritis, it would have been impossible for him to commit the murder. On the 4th of March, Anne Cornock's trial began at the Crown Court. Her defence counsel was Mr. J.D. Caswell, whom we have come across before in this series. Anne's demeanour during proceedings could only be described as emotionless and calm, which the defence counsel explained as that she had suppressed emotions due to the events that occurred within her marriage. The police produced the love letters that had been found, using them as evidence that there was a relationship going on between Anne and Ken. An intimate relationship was again strongly denied by the accused, but who was responsible for the pregnancy was still very much in question. Evidence was given about the strange marks on Cecil's body, and especially the bruises on his head, which it was stated were consistent with being hit with a heavy object prior to his death, rather than the result of him being taken out of the bath. Some ornaments that had been found in the bathroom were displayed in court as possible weapons, but Mr. Caswell showed that these could not have been used in any way, as they had been forensically examined, which showed there was no traces of any evidence whatsoever. Caswell also called his own medical witness, Dr. Gibson, who was an experienced police surgeon who also worked in the casualty department at the Royal United Hospital in Bath. Gibson had carried out an experiment where he was tied up with rope, and after 15 minutes it was removed, and then he sat in a hot bath for half an hour, and as a result of this he was able to demonstrate to the court the rope marks on the wrists were still evident when he got out of the bath. This added credence to the story that the rope had been removed from Cecil's wrists prior to him entering the water. Dr. Gibson also expressed an opinion that the marks on the deceased's head could have been caused by the clumsy removal and move into the bedroom, although he couldn't confirm whether the bruises were caused before death or after death. Gibson had taken the opportunity to share his findings with the renowned Home Office pathologist Sir Bernard Spilsbury, again someone who we've come across in this series. Spilsbury was in declining health and was unable to attend court in Bristol, and sadly committed suicide some months later, but he did query some of the evidence the police had submitted, questioning the quality of the film used to take the photographs of the body, which caused red marks to appear as black. Spilsbury concluded that the photographs were showing bruising on the body that simply wasn't there. The main medical witnesses were now contradicting each other, which would have caused confusion for the jury as to which versions were actually correct. It was now down to the evidence given by the accused, which was given clearly and calmly. She told the court that Cecil often fell asleep in the bath and that he had also been experiencing blackouts, something that had not been stated previously in any of her statements. Asked to explain the delay between finding her husband's dead body and calling the ambulance, she replied that she was upset and confused, and at the time it did not occur to her to call for help. She told the court that she was in a loveless marriage, but even so she was on friendly terms up until his death. She admitted that she and her husband rarely had sex, the last time being about 2 weeks before her husband's demise, hence in her view causing her pregnancy, something that she was not aware of until some time after she had been arrested. The prosecution, on the other hand, questioned some of her actions in order to save her husband's life. Namely, she had previously stated that the first thing she did on finding the submerged body was to test for a pulse prior to raising his head out of the water and check if he was breathing. Sometime in the past, she had been a trainee nurse. The prosecution made inquiries about this and found no record of her being employed in the capacity of trainee anywhere in the area. Anne said that the institution who had employed her had since closed down and records no longer existed. She was asked why she did not send Ken Bedford to summon help from the call box, which was only 200 yards away from the house, or seek help from any of the neighbours. It appeared that Ken had merely stood on the sidelines, taking no action whatsoever except for making a couple of cups of tea. It was Anne who eventually called for help. The prosecution brought up the matter of the love letters, and again she vehemently denied any romantic attachment to Ken, stating that she only wrote those letters to show him that she was capable of doing so, and to prove to him that she could read and write. She was in the habit of writing to her husband while he was away across the country, and on one occasion Ken had mentioned that it really did not look like much of a love letter, at which point she had added some romantic lines to illustrate that she could still write a tender letter. When it came to the summing up for the defence, Mr. Caswell was clear in pointing out the differing views of the expert witnesses and suggested that any discrepancies in Anne's statements to the police could be put down to tiredness and depression at the situation. The prosecution, on the other hand, tried to persuade the jury the possible motive for the murder of Cecil Cornock was the fact that her wish to be rid of him for good and be with her lover Ken Bedford. Clearly a rational conclusion, especially with the added admission that there had been a lengthy delay in summoning help by the accused. It was even suggested that Anne and Ken had spent part of this time getting rid of incriminating evidence. The judge gave the impression that he had some sort of dislike for the accused, at one point producing a plaster cast of her head and illustrating graphically how bruises that were found on the body could have been inflicted, causing unconsciousness, which led eventually to drowning. The judge reminded the jury that the local pathologist had examined the body shortly after death, whereas Dr. Gibson's testimony admitted that he had not directly examined the body. The judge, possibly speaking out of place, said this case was clearly murder and that there was no room for bringing in a verdict of manslaughter. As if to drive this point home, he instructed that the plaster cast should be examined by the jurors, saying it was down to them to decide whether the wounds were either deliberate or accidental. The jury retired to deliberate on the case, and 2 hours later returned to the courtroom to deliver their verdict. It was not guilty. After Anne Cornock was discharged, she left Bristol and went into hiding on the south coast to get away from all the publicity. Interestingly, within a week of the verdict, Ken Bedford went to the local registry office to register the intention of marriage between himself and Anne. At the time, she dismissed the idea of remarriage to reporters, explaining that she had no interest in Ken Bedford at all, and that she had finished their friendship. Anne returned to Bristol some months later, and in the autumn gave birth to a daughter. Nothing else was ever mentioned by herself or Ken Bedford about the fateful events on the night of the previous December that led to the untimely demise of her husband, Cecil Cornock. Now, John, an interesting tale. What do you make of it?
The point about expert witnesses is that they agree on time, method, etc. of the deceased's demise. Otherwise, their evidence is really opinions. Would a person go into a jury box and condemn a person based on just one man's opinion? Would you like to live with your conscience on hearing that you had condemned an innocent woman to the gallows based on one man's opinion, which was false? The 2-month pregnancy of Mrs. Cornock must have preyed on the minds of the jurors. Did they really want to bring another orphan in the world on hearing of the peculiar sexual practices of the late husband?